Hello, lovely people. Welcome to another book chat wrap up, the regular roundup of stuff I've read at some point in my past.
Dooby 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 doo. Dooby 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 Sophie Vlogs.
I've got a whole bunch of books to talk about. I'm just going to dive into it. I will kick things off with Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeleine Thien. I really enjoyed this book. I wasn't quite sure what to expect because it's been on my TBR for a really long time, and you know sometimes you move beyond books and you're like, oh yeah, if I'd read that when it came onto my radar, I'd have loved it, but now I don't. This one I really enjoyed. I found it very thought-provoking, sort of like an intergenerational story. It's set in China. A lot of what it's exploring is the Cultural Revolution. We follow a number of different characters, but we're largely posited around. Well, we have these two plot lines. Like one of them is set in more contemporary times. Essentially, Marie and her mother, who live in Canada, they have this guest come to stay with them, Iming, who has a connection. Her family has a connection with Marie's father, who has recently died of suicide. We flash between this contemporary time back into the past. We're following this family, but it takes a while. It takes a little while for you to figure out exactly which one is Marie's father and which one is Iming's father. One thing I loved about this is that music has a really big role to play in this. There's one character who's a composer, there are other characters who are performers of music, and just the way that music weaved throughout this, it's classical music. It gave me a lot of music to go away and listen to, which I've been really enjoying doing. But this way of dealing with the world with music, processing world through music, how it enriches you, what happens to you if music is denied, how you can hold on to music even though you have no access to it. As you might expect from a novel that is set during the Cultural Revolution, there is a lot of stuff in this that is a bit of a hard read. Equally, there's a lot to do in the more contemporary times that is to do with grief and loss. Many people in this have lost people, not just our main character losing her father, but other people as well. And like the voids, I mean, you can really see it from the cover of this book, the void that people leave behind when they are gone, whether that is when they have passed away, or Marie is trying to track down Iming, and she is this void because she cannot find her. This is just, I felt like it was beautifully written. It really gave me a lot to think about. I'd be really interested to read anything else that this author has written. I don't know if she's done any other books or not, I haven't looked into it yet. But I just essentially I wasn't sure if I was gonna what I was gonna think about it. And actually, I've ended up coming away and being like, that's really one that's gonna stay with me. I think. After that is a book that I DNF'd. This is Spring Snow by Yukio Mishima. This was not a case of I DNF'd this book because I didn't like it. This was more a case of I DNF'd this book because I did not feel the need to continue it. It's set in Tokyo in 1918, and we follow what is your name? I've already forgotten. Kiyoaki, who has been raised among the elegant Ayakura family. They are sort of like a waning aristocracy. He feels a sense of distance from his parents, like their values are not his values. He's very introspective and he spends a lot of time thinking. He's also, I don't know, he's not an easy person to get on with. He keeps barriers up, and essentially he is in love with this childhood friend, but he doesn't really realize it until she's engaged to this crown prince. And in the nicest way, I just felt like I kind of knew where this was going to go. Although there is a plot, and I could see where the plot was going to go, a lot of the text is like him thinking, reflecting, that kind of thing. And I kind of just felt like I wasn't invested enough in the types of musings he was having to stick with this for the whole length when I could already see how it was going to end. I foolishly saw information about what the other books in the series are like and what they centre around, and knowing what they centre around sort of makes it very obvious how this book is going to end. Strangely found it more interesting to research Mishima as a person because he did some things. He was very right-wing, anti-Western, very much wanted to restore the monarchy to Japan. He ended up kind of leading a bit of an uprising and then having to commit seppuku in like 1970. So strangely was more interested to read his Wikipedia article than I actually felt to continue reading this book, not because this book was bad, but just because I just wasn't really invested in how it was telling the tale. And, you know, sometimes it's not like a bad book, it's just not a book that you want to read. and that's fine. Next up, I want to talk about The Madness of Grief by the Reverend Richard Coles. This is a non-fiction book. I read it on my Kindle. It's a very small little book. It is very emotional. Essentially, it is written in the wake of his husband passing away. So as you can imagine, it is all dealing with grief. He manages to do the thing which I feel like really encompasses what grief is like, where you have your really obvious grieving times, and then you just have these times that come out of nowhere and they blindside you. There is a thing that he wrote about his garden blooming and how his husband always used to tend to the garden, and it was like his husband was giving him a bouquet, but he wasn't because he's dead. And I'm even tearing up thinking about it. There are just a number of moments in this where he so succinctly encapsulates grief in such an honest way that I found it supremely emotionally affecting. I will say, I think you will get the most out of this book if you are already a fan of the Reverend Richard Coles, because a lot of it is not actually to do with grief, and is also just to do with, like, how he's getting through the days. So if you're not really invested in him as a person, it's not necessarily like a general musing on grief. It's a very personal book about him and him processing it. So if you don't like him, you won't like the book. So I would say that it's probably something to read if you already are familiar with him and his work, and you kind of want to get his perspective on this experience rather than like a more general perspective on grief in general. Next up, I will only talk about this book briefly, but this is The Isle of the Lost by Melissa de la Cruz, which is the first book of the Disney Descendants series. I read this because my friend and I in our podcast did an episode on the Disney Descendants general franchise, like the films and the book. We read this for it. I won't really talk about it because if you want to know my thoughts on it, listen to that episode. We had a lot of fun. Turns out we have so many opinions on this franchise. We don't know why. We just do. They have all of these concepts that I think are really interesting, and do they interrogate them enough for me? No. Penultimate book I want to talk about is Olive by Emma Gannon. This is a book that was recommended to me by my friend because both of us think that we're probably not going to end up having kids. And this book is about someone called Olive, whose friend group, in varying different ways, either have children or are trying to have children, and she is sort of coming to the realization that she doesn't want children. It leads to a breakup with her long-term boyfriend, and it's kind of one of those where it's like, she's lost, she's finding herself, and it's giving you a lot of different perspectives on the concept of having or not having children, the struggles that come with both options, and that kind of a thing. One thing I liked about this is I did really appreciate those discussions happening. It's not something I've really read a book about before. I really appreciated getting views on what it is like to be on both sides of the arrangement. And it was a perfectly fun read. I sped through it quite quickly. I had a couple of niggles. This is all the way, is it? It's always what I do. I'm like, I like these things, but I had problems. Sometimes characters behaved in certain ways, or things were thrown out there in order to cause conflict in the plot, but they were never really dealt with in a satisfactory manner that I felt gave closure to things, because some people say some horrible things in this, and you kind of reach a point where they all forgive each other, and it's well, no one really sometimes her friends do sideline her, because they don't view what she's going through as important as what they're going through, and that's never really dealt with. Equally, sometimes she throws things out there in a fit of emotion that is horrible, and again, it doesn't really feel like she deals with the ramifications of that. I would also say, and this is a spoiler for the end of the book, so do skip ahead if you do not want to hear this, I got really frustrated because at the end of it, she ends up with a man who already has children who are teenagers, and I felt like in some ways the messaging was, it's okay that she's not going to have children of her own. She still ended up a mother figure, and I think if I spoke to the author, that would not be what she was after trying to say, but there was just an element of the plot feeling that way, which I found a bit disappointing. I would have rather had it that she just didn't have children and wasn't a mother figure to people, and that would have been fine. I don't know. The final book I want to talk about is just a little one. This is Wagner's Ring by M. Owen Lee. It is non-fiction. It is just a discussion of Wagner's Ring cycle, which I have heard music from before, but never actually seen any of the 4 operas all the way through. What he does is he sort of does a summary of the opera at the start of each section, and then sort of delves into it in all of its many ways, whether that's to do with musically, plot-wise, symbolically, his sourcing, all this kind of stuff. Wagner's not my favourite opera composer. I much prefer stuff like Puccini and more like Italian opera, but I picked this up in a kilo sale, so you paid by weight, just because I thought it sounded interesting, and it's definitely given me a better understanding. I have read some of the primary sources, like the Volsanga saga and stuff like that, so it is interesting for me to understand how those sort of got translated into what the Wagner's Ring Cycle plotline is. So yeah, interesting, a little rabble, fun time was had. That's everything I wanted to talk about this week. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts if you've read any of these. Please do leave me a comment down below. Otherwise, I will stop talking, I will let you go about your day, and I will see you next time for something different.